I actually started my webpage, which back then I called it the Colorado Freedom Report, back in late 1998. And first the idea was to write about a very broad range of issues. So the first thing I wrote about was education, because there was an education conference in the state later part of that year. But a few months into this working on this webpage, there was an event that prompted me to change directions for a while. That being, of course, the horrible murders at Columbine High School. And of course, because of that, because it got so much national and international attention, a lot of people started thinking about, well, what are the appropriate laws about gun ownership? And really, what is gun ownership all about? Is this something we should be promoting or not promoting, or how does this work out? So obviously that prompted a big debate, and I spent quite a lot of my time looking into this issue, writing about this issue. But still, I'm still more of a generalist, more of a big picture kind of guy, so I wanted to write about a variety of issues, which I continue to do. And so I thought that we would talk about how gun ownership, the right to own a gun, fits into this broader program of liberty. So that's what I hope to address. But I want to begin by mentioning that I am a staunch advocate of gun control. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that individuals who own a gun ought to control that gun. You got to control your firearm. Right? So the basic principles of gun control correspond to what you know of as the rules of gun safety. Right? So first of all, you need muzzle control. Right? You always keep your gun pointed in a safe direction. You should never point your gun at another human being unless that person is an immediate threat to your life and you intend to shoot that person. Next is chamber control. You got to control your chamber. Always keep your gun unloaded until you're ready to use it. Now I have friends who debate whether you should carry around in the chamber when you're carrying concealed, and I think it depends a lot on context. But still the principle remains, have control over your chamber, over whether you have a round chamber. And of course the third one is trigger control. Always keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to use it. It drives me crazy to watch these Hollywood movies where these alleged law enforcement officers or military personnel are walking around with their gun like this with their finger on the trigger. No one would do that who knows about firearms. It just totally breaks the spirit of the movie for me. But maybe that it's appropriate that the land of fantasy are some of the biggest voices sometimes for stricter gun laws. I saw a Clive Owen, it's just so nutty, I saw a Clive Owen movie once where he put rounds of ammunition between his fingers. This was genius, it was brilliant really. And he stuck his hand in a fire. And the bullet shot across the room and killed the bad guy. It was amazing. If you understand anything about the physics of how this works, you understand that this is complete nonsense. But I guess I guess you can understand that people who get their information about firearms from Hollywood might have some distorted views about how guns work and about what gun ownership is about. So now you know kind of what I mean by gun control. The left means something rather different when they talk about gun control. What they mean is that they want to control how we can buy and exchange guns and gun components, such as magazines. That's what they mean by gun control. So why do they advocate gun control? What do they mean to accomplish? The reason that they usually give off top is they want to control crime, right? Which all of us want to control crime. Crime is any kind of crime is a violation by definition of somebody's rights. And violent crimes are especially heinous and especially destructive to the individual victims. But if you look at the actual gun measures that these groups promote, you have to wonder whether crime control is really their main objective. So consider, for example, the assault weapons ban, quote, which is now defunct. It used to be at the federal level. Of course, this didn't ban ownership of, quote, assault weapons, right? It banned sale, importation of certain guns. But what is an assault weapon? Historically, right, an assault weapon refers to automatics, full automatic guns. But then the left, the anti-gun groups got clever and they said, well, we'll apply this terminology of assault weapon to semi-automatics. So I take it that everyone here knows the basic difference between automatic and semi-automatic. I am recording, so I'll review it briefly for the YouTube audience. A fully automatic, you chamber the first round, you pull the trigger, It fires a round, chambers another round, and it continues to fire until you release the trigger. Semi-automatic, it still typically takes a magazine, not always. Chamber the first round, one pull of the trigger is one fire of a bullet, chambers the next round due to the force of the firing, and then another pull of the trigger fires the next round. Right? So it is legal, contrary to many media reports, it's perfectly legal to own a fully automatic rifle. I've shot one. But you have to have your special IRS tax license in order to lawfully do this. Otherwise, you will end up in pokey because ATF will come after you. So there's a big difference between a real assault rifle and what the left calls an assault rifle, which is really a semi-automatic gun, right? So really, an assault rifle, an assault weapon, is just a semi-automatic gun with a few irrelevant cosmetic differences. And in fact, when the assault weapons ban was in effect, you had these anti-gun groups, the same groups that helped put these laws into effect, crying, oh my goodness, gun manufacturers are just changing these irrelevant cosmetic features and selling the same gun on the open market. Oh my goodness. Right? Well, of course that's what they're doing. That's what the law you wrote told them they had to do. And so, what is the real purpose of this, right? If you ask them, they'll tell you openly. They want to ban all semi-automatic weapons, handguns and rifles. Because it stands to reason, right? If we should ban certain semi-automatics that look ugly, well, then the next criminal is just going to use some other kind of semi-automatic. Well, shouldn't we ban that kind too? And you can see how the logical progression is just to get rid of semi-automatics. And the same thing applies to, quote, high-capacity magazines. Well, if you buy a standard Glock 9mm handgun, what does it come with? It comes with a 15-round magazine. That's not a high-capacity magazine, it's an industry standard magazine. It's what naturally fits into this size of gun and this size of ammunition. So it's ridiculous, just like it's ridiculous to call a random semi-automatic gun an assault weapon. It's ridiculous to call a 15-round magazine for your Glock 9mm high-capacity magazine. Ooh, scary. Right? And so what is, again, the goal, right? If it's bad to have 11 rounds in your magazine, well, is it really so much better to have 10? I mean, can't criminals carry 10 rounds? Or 9? Criminals have an advantage over their victims in the sense that they can plan, prepare for their attack, right? They have the ability to sometimes spend months planning for an attack and really prepare their gear and their mental state to commit this atrocity. Whereas the victim, it's sprung on you, it's out of the blue. So a criminal can easily carry multiple 9 or 10 or however many rounds he wants, fire one round, change it out, replace it, and he can keep doing so until somebody with a gun shoots him or otherwise stops him physically. And so again, the idea is, if it's bad to ban 11-round magazines, well, isn't it just as good to ban 10 or 9-round magazines, so on down the line? Again, the ultimate goal here, as these anti-gun groups state, is to ban semi-automatic guns. Well, some people tell us, well, it's perfectly acceptable to have a revolver, just not these nasty semi-automatics. Yet if you've ever gone shooting, you know how a revolver typically works. The typical revolver, one pull of the trigger, simultaneously cocks the hammer, rotates the cylinder, fires a round. One pull of the trigger, one shoot, one shot. Next pull of the trigger, one shot. There's more mechanically going on than your finger is controlling with a revolver, right? And yet, there's some similarity to a semi-automatic in that one pull of the trigger, one shot. Well, again, criminals have the ability to think about, for long periods of time, how they want to go about committing their crimes. It's just as easy to carry 8 or 10 revolvers as one if you're a criminal in a shoulder bag. Whereas if you're a victim, that's just infeasible, right? You have the ability to carry one practically handgun with you for defensive purposes. So I guarantee you that it's easy for a criminal to fire, to empty one revolver after another, and then just toss them aside, right? Because that's the advantage the criminal has, is this advantage of preparation and this ability to choose a variety of weapons to meet his purposes. So what we see here is that these laws aren't really affecting criminals, they're affecting people who use these guns for self-defense. Now, what if you're facing multiple attackers? Or what if you're facing attackers with heavy leather jackets or even some light armor? You might want more than the legally allotted 10 rounds of ammunition if that particular law were in effect and prevented you from buying, quote, high capacity magazines. We should call them industry standard magazines, right? So these laws affect the law abiding. They don't really do much for the criminal. But I think that there is a reason that's worth noting here as an aside as to why certain criminals behave as they do. If you're the type of criminal who wants your name plastered across every newspaper, your photograph plastered across every newspaper in the country, every news website in the country, and indeed across the world, there's one easy way to accomplish that, which is to commit a mass murder with a firearm. If you do that, the media will hand you everything you want, which is all the attention, the instant national and international infamy. And I think that helps to explain part of why certain criminals behave in certain ways, at least in this country. So let's back up to the broader issue here and talk about why people have a right to own a gun. I'm talking about a moral right to own a gun, which the political system properly recognizes. Right? So we can talk about political rights, which should recognize what you have a moral right to do. And basically, the right to own a gun stems from your fundamental right to life, which immediately means that you have the right to defend your life against people who would do you harm. Right? So there's an immediate moral grounding. If you have a right to life, you have a right to defend your life. And the most practical way to defend your life is with these useful tools of self-defense, which are, in today's world, firearms, and particularly, in many contexts, semi-automatic handguns, rifles are the most effective tools of self-defense. It's clear that people do, in fact, use guns for defensive purposes. I'm sure you've heard some of the statistics. The most recent study about this was put out by the Cato Institute, and it's in a longish article. It's 60 pages, so a small book, called Tough Targets. And they go through many, many accounts drawn from the media of people who use a firearm for self-defense throughout the United States. So of course this is limited because it only is those cases reported in the media. And many cases of using a gun defensively is never reported through the media, or even necessarily through police, right? But still, it gives you a good indication of part of what's happening. And this Cato study also reviews some of the older literature about people using guns defensively. And the very lowest, most conservative estimates is that people use guns in the United States defensively at least tens of thousands of times a year. And maybe much more, and it probably was more when crime rates were higher. So I think it is worth us on both sides of the gun debate to step back and look at some of the context here so we can think reasonably about what are the real risks in life. So I looked up the National Vital Statistics Report. It's almost as boring as it sounds. And it's from earlier this year, but it reports on 2010. So it's a couple of years old, the data. But the first 4 causes of death are actually health-related, as you might expect. The first one being heart disease. So there are about 2.5 million deaths in the United States in 2010. The 5th highest cause of death was actually unintentional injuries. And that was 118,000 deaths, roughly. This includes motor vehicle deaths, which is about 35,000 deaths that year. The 10th leading cause of death for 2010 was suicide, and there were about 38,000 suicide deaths. So it might surprise some people, I think, to realize that homicide does not make the top 10 in causes of death. In fact, I'll read you a quote from this study. Assault homicide fell from among the top 15 leading causes of death in 2010, replaced by pneumonitis due to solids and liquids as the 15th leading cause of death. That's a type of lung disease, if you haven't heard of it. So a couple years ago, there was actually just over 16,000 homicides. Remember that not all homicides are murders, right? They're murder and justifiable homicide. And of those, just over 11,000 were firearms related. Now, you get people who are opposed to gun ownership saying some silly things sometimes, like, well, if we would just ban guns, we could eliminate those 11,000 homicides. Look, we have 11,000 firearms-related homicides. Let's just get rid of those by banning guns. Of course, in reality, it doesn't work that way. Because, as noted, criminals can easily switch to other types of weapons. Especially, it's often the case that criminals, violent criminals, are physically larger, more powerful than their victims. So they can easily overpower their victims with whatever weapon is at hand, clubs, knives, whatever. Whereas, who is it especially important to make sure that they have the right to own a gun is the victim, who is often maybe a smaller woman, maybe an elderly person who can't get around quite as well. And so that's who is important to protect the right of gun ownership for. Now, so what's interesting here is that we've seen a couple of trends in the last few years. We've seen crime rates go down precipitously, even as what has happened to gun ownership rates. I don't know. I have not seen this personally, but I've heard of gun stores that will put up a large photograph of Barack Obama saying, Barack Obama, no, it says Barack Obama, gun salesman of the year. Because people have been buying guns like crazy. So I'm going to read you a couple of news items that I dug up. Here's something from the Christian Science Monitor from earlier this year. It says in the past 20 years, the murder rate in the United States has dropped by almost half, from 9.8 per 100,000 people in 1981 to 5 in 2009. Meanwhile, robberies were down 10% in 2010 from a year before and 8% in 2009. And just Google gun sales increase or something like that, and you will find numerous stories of people buying more guns. In part because people are just interested in self-defense, in part because people are worried that the federal government is going to crack down on gun ownership. So it's sort of ironic that the more the left talks about controlling guns, the more guns people tend to buy. Now, Gallup does surveys of gun owners, and these are not very reliable because, as you can imagine, people are sometimes hesitant to share with strangers on the phone the kinds of stuff that they own, especially firearms. And so you can take these surveys with a grain of salt. Nevertheless, I'll read you what Gallup reported the latter part of last year. 47% of American adults currently report that they have a gun in their home or elsewhere on their property. This is up from 41% a year ago and is the highest Gallup has recorded since 1993. So for what it's worth, again, it indicates that people are perhaps more interested in guns in current times. So how do people use guns for self-defense? I guess the most common is simply to have a gun in the home in case somebody breaks into your house trying to do you harm. So common guns for this are semi-automatic handguns or revolvers or pump-action shotguns. I imagine it's not pleasant if you're a criminal expecting to get away with some crime to hear the sound of a pump-action shotgun rifle. Or my grandmother, she lived in a more rural area, so she actually kept her hunting rifle in her bedroom for use for self-defense if she were to need it. Thankfully, she never needed it. But there were some crimes in her general area during some stretches, so she was glad to have it. Obviously, there's concealed carry. Here in Colorado and in most states now, it's legal to carry concealed. Typically, you have to get a license. I think that we should have a dual system where you can get the license for reciprocity, but you're not required to get the license to carry concealed. But that's up to the legislature. I will remind you of the story of the New Life Church. When Gina Som, this was 2007, a man committed a double murder at one location, went to New Life Church, just not very far from this location, and killed 2 more people. But thankfully, they had a volunteer security guard there named Jean Assam, and she pulled her handgun out and shot the guy, and then he shot himself and killed himself. But she stopped the criminal attack. And her pastor credited her with saving untold numbers of lives that day. And incidentally, there's one thing we know about the Aurora Theater where the horrific murders took place not too long ago, which is that chain posted at their front door that you are forbidden from carrying concealed handguns in the theater. What is that communicating to criminals? If you want to do something bad, nobody can fight back here. There's a couple of things that people talk about which I'll mention. I think that they're very low risk, but I'll mention it. Some nations have descended from relatively free states to dictatorships relatively quickly, meaning a span of decades, right? I don't think this is likely in the United States in my lifetime. I don't think you can rule it out in the next 100 years. Or foreign invasion. I don't think that you can totally rule out a newly aggressive Russia some decade down the road, or even a militarized China some decade down the road. And I think it's important. It's meaningful for citizens to be able to know how to use firearms. So if there needs to be a military push to fight against aggressors, it's nice to have people who are familiar with how firearms operate, and that step of their training is already taken care of to some degree. But of course, the most common thing, other than simply those single or double criminals, is the breakdown of law and order, which can be due to a natural catastrophe or a man-made catastrophe. So I thought I'd read you something from NPR. Surprisingly, NPR has had some really good reporting of firearms issues in the last few months, which is nice. I still don't think they should be taking any tax dollars, but I'm glad that they exist, and I think they should continue to exist without tax dollars, and they do some really good work. Here's a quote from a story earlier this year, which was retrospective. The Los Angeles riots stunned the nation in 1992, claiming more than 50 lives in that city. As the unrest approached Koreatown, store owner Ki Hwan Ha mobilized his fellow business owners to arm themselves and defend their property. Now, there's something to notice during these kind of catastrophes. What happens to the police? One of two things. They're either preoccupied in the especially hot zones, where it's really busy, or they have a sick day and they stay home to take care of their families. In other words, during some of these crises, which is low risk, but during your lifetime, you might face a crisis like that. When you most need a police response, it's exactly the time when you're least likely to get it. So, friends, it ain't about duck hunting. The right to own a gun is about being able to defend ourselves from people who would do us harm. So what should we do? As mentioned, we all want to cut crime. Out of those 16,000 homicides, assuming that they're mostly murders, obviously we'd like to get that down as low as possible. As nice as it is that that's been dropping, we want it to drop all the way, as close to zero as we can. So what can we do realistically to curb crime? How about this as an idea? Spend our law enforcement resources going after criminals instead of peaceable citizens. That's, I think, the big idea. It has helped to get violent people off the streets with lengthy sentences. I think that's appropriate for violent attackers. I do not think it's appropriate for people who are not violating other people's rights. I think that it's helpful to have things like intensive parole. If somebody has demonstrated the propensity to attack others, hey, they need some extra attention, even if we're going to let them out of prison. I think it's important to monitor people who make threats. I think, I'm not an expert in this, but I've read accounts that it's more difficult for people with mental health issues to get the help they need these days relative to previous decades. And that sounds very plausible to me. I've heard some good plausible accounts of that. So if that, to the extent that that's a problem, yeah, I think it's important for people to get the help they need. Being mindful of the fact that many people with mental illness never hurt anybody else, and then we have the problem, right, if we assign somebody to determine who all the mentally ill people are, well, who watches the watcher, and how do we keep that from being abused? So there are problems, but I think that it's possible to work within people's rights and still offer people the help they need. It is worth noting that the perpetrator of the Aurora murders communicated his intention before he committed it. His psychologist was so concerned about this, she broke patient-doctor confidentiality and reported this guy to the police, and the police did nothing. So again, I think the big idea is spend our law enforcement resources going after violent people, going after criminals, not harassing, intimidating, prosecuting, imprisoning peaceable citizens who never violate anybody's rights. I want to make a somewhat broader point here. I've indicated that it doesn't really make a lot of sense that the left proposes these laws in order to curb crime. They don't really affect criminals. What they do is they make it harder for good people to defend themselves against criminals. So they're counterproductive in that way. So why is the left, and I'm talking about a particular segment of the left, I'm not talking, many Democrats are pro-gun. Many people who consider themselves to be on the left are pro-gun. For example, Dave Kopel, who works at the Independence Institute, he's a lifelong Democrat and a proud-paying member of the ACLU. And there are aspects of the left which are civil libertarian in nature, and I have more in common with them. But I'm talking about this big government, the state controls all aspects of your life type of left. Why do they advocate gun control? Well, I want to draw your attention to a few elements of gun control that I think helps explain this. If you have the ability to own a gun, if the government recognizes your right to own a gun, that means that you are fundamentally responsible for your own life, for defending your own life against a violent aggressor. If you're fundamentally responsible for your own life, you might get this crazy idea that you should be responsible for your entire life. Instead of having cradle to grave, exactly, dependency on the government. If you own a gun, or even can contemplate your ability to own a gun, you might get this crazy idea that people have free will. The guns do not send out these mind control waves to turn ordinary people into vicious criminals. That doesn't happen. Instead, guns are inanimate objects, and we human beings have free will, and people are the ones who control what guns do. Obviously, gun ownership is consistent with all of our individual rights. We have the right to own guns, we have the right to own property, guns being a type of property. We have the right to control our voluntary exchanges with others, including firearms. So this has ramifications for our other rights. It reminds the citizenry, it reminds us that there's areas where the government should keep its hands out of our business, keep its nose out. There's some things that we should do on our own without the government overseeing everything that we do and every step that we take. The gun ownership, I think, reminds us that we are sovereign individuals. It reminds us of these words you might have heard, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government. It's not the case that government dictates to us what we can do and what our rights are, right? Government gets its just powers from our consent. And I think an armed population is much more likely to remember this basic relationship of the citizenry and the government. So in short, the right to own a gun, even if you choose not to own a gun, is a good reminder and a great cultural marker for the principle of individual responsibility. At some fundamental level, you are responsible for your own life. And I think that goes a long way toward explaining why this aspect of the left, a portion of the left, is so strongly, viscerally against citizen gun ownership, and why they so strongly want to ban guns. And I think it also explains why advocates of liberty, advocates of individual rights, should stand up and champion the moral right of gun ownership and the corresponding legal right, the government recognition of that right, to own a gun for defensive purposes.